Yo, it's Grego, and in this video, I take the second best tier character from Super Smash Bros. Melee, Roy, and demake them in the style of the original Super Smash Bros. For the N64. You're probably thinking, why Roy? Because someone already did Marth, okay. So let's go with the second best Fire Emblem character in Melee. For reference, I'll be using images of Roy to get the silhouette and design down, and Link's Smash 64 model for the poly count, topography, and how to go about painting my textures. I figured he'd make the best reference, seeing how he was the only one in Smash to wield a sword before it was cool. With his sword and shield, Link comes up to about 488 triangles. So to give myself a little bit of leeway, I set my cap at 500. And with all that said and done, I open up Blender and start my model. Pretty much all my models start out as a cube, and I use a mirror modifier, so I just have to worry about one side of the mesh. From here, it's moving, scaling, and rotating parts of the mesh to get it to the shape that I'm looking for. Since I'm working with a low poly aesthetic, limbs like the arms, legs, and head will be their own separate mesh. I start them out as a cube and add more vertices as I go. I'd say the most difficult part in making these kinds of models is trying to keep the poly count low while adding just enough detail to get a good silhouette. But I'd suggest worrying about making the model look nice regardless, and trying to find places on where you can save vertices later. But that isn't to say there aren't some perks. I mean, hands are literal blocks, you just gotta shape them into a fist. For making the head, I always apply a subsurface modifier to a cube so I can start off with a spherical base. I pulled the bottom vertices forward for the chin and the vertices that represent the cheeks. Since Roy's a cute anime JRPG boy, I made wide faces for the eyes. For the hair, I made separate spiky strands and merged them into one, which is pretty time consuming. Finally, I give the mesh one final pass to see if I can lower the poly count by just a little bit. I clocked in at 497 triangles, which is cutting it pretty close, but I still had opportunities to edit my mesh while it was Texturing is by far my favorite phase when creating a model. Where you sacrifice detail to abide by a small poly count, you can make up for it in nicely painted textures. Lately, with my most recent models, I've been using a different method of texturing than normal. Originally, I'd unwrap and map my UVs into one file, and then make the texture using the UV mappings as a guide. However, with trying to remain as faithful to the styles as I could, I'd noticed the textures for the models I'd use for reference would either come separate or in one file with each part seeming to be its own sprite. So lately, my method has been to make a sprite within a small resolution, unwrap the model's UVs, and map them to fit the sprite. And for the sake of good practice, I make sure to pack them all into one file once I'm done. And honestly, I've really been enjoying this method so far. I feel like each part of the texture is taking the most optimum amount of space, and if not, it's very easy to go back and edit rather than overestimating the importance of one part of the model in the UV mapping and pretty much having to restructure the whole thing or leaving big open unused spaces. I will say, if you're a beginner, it's probably best if you use the other method, as I feel like you need a good understanding of UVs to be able to freely edit and remap them once you're packing all your textures. Now, in terms of texturing Roy, I actually overestimated the amount of space the torso should take, and went a little bit too detailed. I was pretty bummed because I actually liked how it turned out, but to try to stick with the style that I'm going for, I lowered the resolution from 64 by 64 pixels to 32 by 32, and after some editing, I was content with how my model was turning out. And from here on out, I'd stick to these dimensions. For N64 style models, I keep linear interpolation enabled for textures, whereas with a PS1 aesthetic, I'd set it to closest. I also manually applied anti-aliasing to give a more painted look, similar to how Link's textures were set up. One of the biggest challenges for texturing was the face, more specifically the eyes, that in my first attempt made my model look like Jimmy Neutron. Solving this was just a matter of constant trial and error and keeping my references close by. Eventually, I managed to achieve a look that wasn't so, fish-like. For the hair, I made a bunch of strokes of dark, mid, and light tones to represent strands and applied a Gaussian blur over it. I mapped segments of the hair separately to give the look of individual clumps. From here, I just had to finish the texture and remap the UVs into one file. Here's a quick tip in remapping your UVs. Let's say you have a 32 by 32 texture and you want to remap it to a texture that's 128 by 128. Simply take the ratio of each dimension, since it's a square you only have to do it once, and use that percentage at which to rescale the UVs. As for positioning, you're on your own. During this process, I was able to do some more edits to the mesh, with the final poly count being 470 triangles. Now with the texture done, it's time to make Roy's bones. Fuck, that's not what I... To give your creation life, you must give it bones. Most of my models get a pretty standard skeleton, with bones that'll be symmetrical having .L or .R appended to them. The only special thing I do with my armatures is add inverse kinematics to the legs to make posing easier. You add a bone at the end of the calf bone, unparented, and use that as a target for the IK with a chain length of 2. Add a pull target if you want the legs to bend a certain way, and you'll most likely have to reset the roll on the bones. You can get a better explanation from this tutorial, which I followed when I was just starting out 3D modeling in Blender. Now I parent the armature to my model and paint the weights. As a low poly model with separate limbs, it isn't difficult to weight paint as some bones will get 100% of influence over some parts. However, it's still one of my least favorite parts of the process. Once the rig is done, I can pose my model and render the final results. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. The challenge was really fun, and I feel like I learned a lot from it. If you want to see more of my handsome face, subscribe and follow me on my other platforms. I stream some work on Twitch and make similar short videos on my TikTok. If you like the Roy model, become a patron and gain access to some of my best models. Finally, leave a like if you learned something. See you later.